You my pa?
Just because a man meets a woman in a barroom don't mean he's your pa.
We got the same job.
Lots of people got the same job.
283, Baker, take two.
The Last Picture Show and What's Up Doc had been released, and they were both very successful. In fact, they were both on the top 10 Variety box office list, so I was very happy, and I was also in demand. And Paramount came to me with a script called Addie Pray, written by Alvin Sargent, based on a book by Joe David Brown. And I didn't read it because I was at the moment involved with Warner Brothers preparing a large-scale Western. It was specifically written for John Wayne, Jimmy Stewart, Henry Fonda. It was a big cast. Well, months passed. The script was finished, or at least the finished first draft. John Wayne turned it down. So sometime toward the middle of the year, I was without a picture to make, and Paramount came back and said, now, you're not doing the Western. Will you reconsider Addie Pray? So I read it, and I thought it had some promise, but I wasn't sure if it was something I should do. And I asked my ex-wife, Polly Platt, who'd worked with me on the other 3 pictures I'd made, to read it and see what she thought. Well, she said she thought I ought to try it, and I said, why? And she said, you know, you have 2 daughters, and it might be interesting to you to do a father-daughter story. I thought that was a good reason. She said, you know, if you decide to do it, I think I have an idea of somebody who could play the girl, Tatum O'Neal.
I told him about Tatum. I imitated her whiskey voice. I read a couple of the speeches from the script to him the way she would. He took my word for it, and right there his eyes lit up, and he said, we'll do that, and we'll have Ryan play the father.
I had done What's Up Doc with Ryan. We got along well, and I liked him. And I went to confirm my suspicion about Tatum. Of course, she'd never acted. She was about 8. I went down to visit her down in Malibu, where Ryan was living. So I came in and met her, and she said, hello. And she has this deep voice, you know. And Ryan says, gee, you're looking good. You know, you ought to come out here to the beach and run on the beach, you know, it'd be good for you. And Tatum says, oh, Dad, he's not the type. Well, I looked at her, I said, well, now, why do you say that, Tatum? Why would you say that? And she said, oh, well, you never take your shoes off, or, you know, always keep your shirt on. And I looked at Ryan and I said, she'll do. And that's how she got the part. I thought if she was that mature to make such a correct call about me being a New York kid, she'd probably be all right. And that's what happened. So then we talked to Paramount, and I said, want Ryan and Tatum O'Neal. But we went around and around about it, and I said, well, I'm going to do it with them or I'm not going to do it. And we did it. That's how it got started.
How come you're taking me?
Huh?
How come you're taking me?
Alvin Sargent, who was the screenwriter on the picture, we had a long meeting. When it was over, he said, I just want you to know that you made the archetypal director's remark. I said, really, what did I say? He said, you said, Alvin, it's a very good script, it just needs a total rewrite. And I guess we did give it a total rewrite, but not entirely. But the script began in a movie theater where Addie is watching Shirley Temple on the screen, and somebody comes and tells her, Addie, your mother died. Well, I thought, you know, let's just go to the funeral. And we find out it's her mother at the funeral.
Frankie Roosevelt said we gotta look out for one another.
I don't care about Frankie Roosevelt.
But he says it.
That's so?
And the other big thing we changed in the first act was it didn't have an ending, the first act. We needed to have a scene. And I said to Al, I said, Lino, can you write a scene where they are in the car or something and they're fighting, they have a big argument.
There's a depot in Lincoln. You can take me to Lincoln.
You bet I will.
And then they make up, and then they're closer than ever, and that's the end of the first act. And you sort of get, okay, they're gonna go on together.
Let's go!
Hurry up, Doctor. This baby's got to go winky-tinky.
There was a big section in the book about Trixie Delight, and the whole thing about meeting Trixie and him getting infatuated with Trixie, and then Addie maneuvering her out of the picture and all that at a hotel. All that was not in the script, and I said, let's take that whole sequence and let's make that the second act.
Come on.
The whole last half of the book was Addie at a house with an older woman, and it's a whole other story. We didn't want to use any of that. So we didn't have an ending. And we went to Kansas to shoot without really an ending that anybody was that happy with, which is always a little nerve-wracking, but that's how we started shooting with that kind of situation. What I do when I'm doing a period picture, I always look to see what songs were popular in that year and the preceding few years. And since I had zeroed in on 1935, I looked at a lot of song titles, and I have this book that has a list of all these songs. I come across a song title, It's Only a Paper Moon, written by Harold Arlen and Yip Harburg, who wrote Over the Rainbow. It's Only a Paper Moon, and I saw that title, and for some reason those two words, Paper Moon, just jumped out at me. And I thought, it's a good title. I didn't like the title, Addie Pray. It was the name of the book, and I didn't like it. It sounded like a snake or something. So I suggested this to Paramount. I said, I think it was Frankie Blount. So I said, don't you like this title, Paper Moon? He said, what does that mean? I said, well, it's better than Addie Pray. He said, Addie Pray was a bestseller. I said, how many copies did it sell? He says, 100,000 copies in hardcover. I said, well, boy, if we get 100,000 people to see the picture, we're really going to have a hit. He said, all right. He said, let's not talk about it right now. And I was kind of troubled, and I was friendly with Orson Welles, and he was at that time in Rome. So I called him up in Rome, and I said, Orson, can you hear me? Yes. What do you think of this title? Paper Moon. There was a pause. And then he said, that title is so good, you shouldn't even make the picture, just release the title. So I called Alvin Sargent, who was the screenwriter on the picture. I said, Alvin, remember those cutout paper moons they used to have in carnivals? You know, you sit in the moon, have your picture taken. I said, Polly has a photograph of her father sitting in one of those paper moons. He said, yeah. I said, well, we've already got a carnival scene in the picture. Let's add a scene where she wants to have her picture taken in the paper moon and he doesn't want to do it, something like that. He said, why? I said, well, then we can call the picture Paper Moon and nobody will wonder why. He said, okay. And that's how we got the title. And of course, when the book was reissued, at that time, it came out as Paper Moon.
Hey now, I thought you were going to sit in the moon with your pa.
He ain't my pa.
I think one of the things that Peter liked about how they made films in the old days was that it used to be sort of a ensemble cast, an in-house cast that were used from movie to movie, sort of a theater group of people that were like a big family. And certainly we started doing that on Last Picture Show and on What's Up Doc, and we brought almost all the same actors from What's Up Doc into Paper Moon, and then of course we added Tatum.
Now come on down to the car and let's all be friends. You see me smile, come on, let's be
Dear
smiling.
Madeline Kahn, she'd come to see me when I was casting What's Up Doc, and I went to New York to see some actors. I just met with her, and I thought she was just funny. And she kept saying, why are you laughing? I said, well, you're funny. She said, oh, I am? And she didn't realize how funny she was. So she was introduced to the screen on What's Up Doc, and she was very successful in that. And then when we added Trixie Delight to the movie, she was my first choice. We didn't read her. We just said, you want to play this? She said yes, and that was that.
Everything's going to be all right. You just let me do the talking.
John Hillerman, he and I knew each other from when I was 18, way back in New York. We both worked at Joe Papp's New York Shakespeare Festival in Central Park. We were both sort of glorified extras. And he played the teacher in The Last Picture Show, and then he played the hotel manager in What's Up Doc. And those were his first two pictures. I thought he'd be right to play the bootlegger, and then since the bootlegger and the sheriff, they were brothers, I had the idea to have the same actor play both parts.
Where you heading?
We shot those two sequences a few weeks apart so he could lose the weight. He had to really gorge himself to gain weight for the bootlegger, and then he had to work like hell to lose the weight.
Let's go.
Make him say K for old Leroy.
Randy Quaid was another actor we introduced in The Last Picture Show. He was a wonderful natural actor. So I had a small part in What's Up Doc where he played a professor. And then he got a big part in The Last Detail with Jack Nicholson. So he was getting ready to do this, and we were casting Paper Moon, and we couldn't find anybody that was right to play the hillbilly. So I called Randy. I said, listen, I know you're a star now, but do you think you could play a smaller role for me, just to kind of... Oh, he said, yeah, of course I'll do it. So he came down and shot. We had Randy play that part. It's a short scene, but it was very important, and he was terrific. P.J. Johnson played Trixie's maid, and we saw about 7 girls. They were okay. Nobody was great. They all did readings. P.J. came in, and as she's walking, she's 16 years old, and she looks at me, she says, "Ooh-wee, you good looking." I said, "You just got the part." And that was it. I thought if that girl has the guts to say that, she'd be all right.
Well, I'm going to have to be going. It's a long way to St. Louis.
Where are we now?
We just left Plainville. Me and my little girl are going to St. Joe.
We gotta go through Paradise and Waldo and Luray and
Luray,
Lucas
huh?
and
The book was set in the Deep South. Polly and I talked about it, and we thought maybe it'd be a good idea to move it from the South, which sort of was a little bit had been done a lot. Polly reminded me that when we drove across the country in the mid-'60s, there were no hills in Kansas. And so we thought it'd be interesting to shoot a picture in Kansas because it's so flat. So we thought maybe we'd move the whole thing to the Midwest.
I never forgot the landscape of Kansas and how lonely and how evocative it was. It was America with the weathered barns and these houses out in the middle of nowhere that had once been farmhouses. There were no trees anywhere. So I remembered this extraordinary landscape.
And instead of looking for locations in the Deep South, Polly and the associate producer, Frank Marshall, who went on a location scout to Kansas and then eventually Missouri, and that's where we ended up shooting the picture.
One of the great things about the towns that we were visiting is that they were untouched. It was important for us to find them, obviously, in a place that we could get to within an hour, and they were laid out in Kansas. I remember they were laid out on grids. It was very easy to figure how far away these towns were. So we picked our one base in Hays, Kansas for all of the traveling farm stuff and small town stuff, and then we picked St. Joe, Missouri as our big city locations.
Come on.
Where are we going?
We're going to get us some fancy new outfits with this money you got for Aunt Helen.
All the stores were created. They were empty buildings. And we were able to collect, counters and glass cases and so on and so forth. We literally had to build, not the exterior, but we had to build the interior of all of those shops. Another thing I did was make sure that all the cars were much older, because one of the things I noticed when I was in Kansas, this was in 1970 or 71, I noticed that no one in Kansas had new cars. Everybody had cars that were at least 10 years old, even then. I realized that I had to use things that were much older. I looked at all the photographs of old towns, and in the olden days, cars were parked head in, not parallel parked on the street. And I think that's one of the things that makes it look so authentic, is that the cars are all parked at an angle.
But a little bit of progress had crept into St. Joe, Missouri, so we had to deal with things like parking meters and street lights and signs, modern signs, and they were extremely cooperative in letting us cut down the parking meters and take down the signs and everything, and as long as we put them back. In one case on the parking meters, we did put them back, but we put them back backwards, so we had to put them back twice.
I always get a little nervous before the first day of shooting. A little apprehensive, And then it's a strange thing, but I walk on the set, and there's all the trucks and the crew and the cables and the dressing rooms and all that. And I said, what was I nervous about? This is home.